Hello everybody, I'm Matt Anderson and welcome to The Road Not Taken, how ordinary people got out of their own way and you can too. Very excited to introduce our guest today. It's Matt Jackson, who's an economics professor at the University of Stanford, and here's his most recent book called The Human Network that we'll be spending plenty of time discussing. And Matt, if I could turn it over to you just to sort of introduce yourself and sort of how this topic that your book covers sort of relates to, I guess, helping people improve themselves and get out of their own way in life.
Yeah, sure, Matt. So thanks for having me. I think I got interested in this by really trying to understand power and understanding how people get influence and how their social position affects who they know and how they influence other people and how that relates to opportunities that they get. And it's something I just became intrigued with and started studying about a few decades ago. And now I think there's a lot of science that we understand that can really help people understand the world around them.
And if you had to pick one topic, I always like to start with a specific question. What do you think most people could do differently to get out of their own way? If you had to pick one thing to start with.
Sure. I think the major thing that I do myself, and I think other people can do once they realize how important this is just put yourself in uncomfortable situations. And by that I mean, go talk to people that you normally wouldn't talk to. Go, for me, it's going to conferences that are outside of my normal area. And meeting people that I wouldn't have met otherwise and learning about things that I wouldn't have learned about otherwise. So, the most creative thoughts and the most interesting things you learn are not from people that are just like you and you're talking to on an everyday basis, but they're from, people that you wouldn't normally have talked to and you wouldn't normally have interacted with. And that's something that it really goes against our nature. Mm-hmm. Our nature is, even when you're talking to somebody, your natural inclination is to try and find common things, that's when you meet somebody, you're always asking, where did you come from? Where's your background? And you're sort of looking for commonality. And instead, really focus on the things that are different and go after those. And I think that's really difficult. But when you see the networks and you see how introspective they are, you realize how important this is.
Now, the purpose of this podcast is to help people, I would say, elevate where they are now. So when you talk about meeting people in different places or situations, how might you apply that to a business standpoint? Now I admit that I can certainly immediately see that most of the best business ideas that I'm aware of often came from people, as you said, that came one industry borrows a great idea from a different industry.
Yeah, exactly.
I understand that concept myself, but for people to sort of elevate their own lives, what does that look like?
I think part of it is, when you're seeking out information and you're thinking about trying to learn new things, a lot of that happens from contexts that sort of go beyond your immediate neighborhood and your immediate people, friends and acquaintances, and that means sort of searching a little bit further and trying to understand that networks tend to be compartmentalized and. And I think part of the difficulty is that sometimes when you do this, it doesn't work, right? So, you can go out there and say, that was a waste of time. And also there's a language barrier. So for instance, for me, if I go to a conference that's, not economists and they're talking a different language and it takes a while to get used to that. But I think part of it is, you have to sort of push through that and spend a little time thinking about what people are doing and why they're doing it, and people are smart and they have a lot to say, and being able to to sit through that and eventually connect to people is really important.
So perhaps it might be easiest can you start with an example or two from your own world? You mentioned you go to different types of conferences, so let's start with that, because I need some help too, and maybe from you, well, hopefully from you as well, in terms of connecting the dots to people in the audience.
Sure.
I've got a mishmash of things going through my head when I hear about, networking's certainly been a topic I've done a lot of training on for other people. And so I tend to think of things like target marketing and things that, have that strategy behind them. But as you say, I want to hear I want to hear the specifics from you. So you say you go to different conferences. Give us an example of a different non-economics conference that you went to and how that helped you, I guess, understand more.
Sure. So for instance, research in networks nowadays is actually very widespread and cuts across disciplines. So it's not only, sociologists have been at it for a century. Statistical physicists study it. Computer scientists study it. Mathematicians are studying areas of graph theory and so forth. And so, for instance, one of the first conferences I went to that was outside of economics was a conference that's run by a group of sociologists called the Sun Belt Conference. And going to that sort of opened my eyes to how many different applications there were, and the varied applications there were, and the kinds of data that was available, and things that were completely different from the types of questions that economists were asking, right? So sociologists think about things from a very different perspectives, and so it not only opened my eyes to the types of studies they were doing, but also the kinds of questions they asked and the way they asked them, and suddenly it was a different mindset. And then going and looking at the way the physicists look at the problem is completely different, and they have a different perspective and a different language and a different way of thinking about things. And familiarizing yourself with all these really gives you a much more holistic picture of how, for me of how to do the research, but more generally, whatever profession you're in, or whatever you're doing, and enriching yourself in those ways, I think is where real creativity comes from, and suddenly, as you're saying, you can connect dots that you didn't connect before, and understand things in a much different way.
So again, I can only think off the top of my head here. So I'm thinking of people where, quite a lot of people listening here are business owners or they're in sales. And so quite often they're given almost a recipe about how to build their business. So some of them might be thinking, gosh, I don't know if I need to be more creative. I can think, as you discuss this, that certainly knowing a wider variety of people makes us more perhaps empathic. It might make us more effective with relationships we build, which of course is useful for everybody. Talk about how different ways of thinking have helped you, or let me give an example of kind of an epiphany that you had at one of these different non-economist conferences.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, I think, maybe the epiphany is you don't realize how constrained and narrow your own thinking is until you start, people start asking you questions. Why on earth would you be looking at it from that perspective? And from your own usual perspective, that's the way you do things, right? So maybe if you're in marketing, you have a certain way of thinking about marketing, but it might be that somebody asks you a very basic question and questions something that you think is fundamental and obvious, and then you realize, oh, it's not obvious. It's, and the way economists do things is we have a very specific paradigm, and it's very powerful because we all speak the same language, but it's a very narrow way of thinking about human behavior, and so suddenly this sort of opens up a different set of tools and models and ways of thinking about things. And I think in general, it can make you realize that you have your own biases that you weren't aware of.
Like if you were to do a workshop on that topic alone, what would be a useful exercise for people to start with? And really where I'm going with this is almost like a journaling exercise for people listening. Because, there's no, obviously, you know a lot more about this than I do, but I know a lot about limiting beliefs, and I typically have thought of them in a more in a way that's typically closer to our own world, rather than thinking, for example, the biggest epiphany I've had from your book, and just so you know, I haven't read. I know enough to be dangerous about your book. I haven't read it all. I've had a few days, but I did have an epiphany, and that was, oh my goodness, growing up in middle class England, I didn't realize how negative of a common perception we had about wealthy people. That the general consensus about wealthy people, whether they were snobs, and that they got where they got because they'd exploited others. And I didn't realize how damaging that was to my own economic growth, mm-hmm. Right? So that'd be one great example of what you're talking about. We don't realize how constrained our thinking is. So what would be a good exercise to get people to sort of even begin to stop and actually ask themselves about what's, the common thoughts that they might have?
I think part of it is, and this is something I think I do a lot more myself now, is when you think about things or you have a certain opinion, you ask yourself where you got that from, mm-hmm. right? Why is it that I have this opinion? Where did it come from? And now when I'm talking to people, I ask people for more information about sources. Somebody tells me, I don't know, this is something we should do, or I heard this. Well, where did you hear it, and why do you really believe it? And sort of digging a little deeper, because our networks are very insular, right? As you're pointing out, you can be in a certain class of people with a certain type of view, and you get these echoes, and everybody's saying the same thing. And humans are sort of innate counters, right? If I hear something a lot, I tend to believe it. And so if you start asking yourself, why do I believe something? Where did this come from? Where did this belief come from? That's, I think, a very liberating exercise, because you realize that you might not have heard the information from from all the sources, and you might not really be getting good information and a really rich, diverse set of information that you need to make a good decision.
Yeah, no, that's priceless, because I've typically thought of this just in terms of easier, lower, more immediate examples, like our parents, in terms of the influence they had on our beliefs, and I think I've made my own progress in terms of my own development by realizing that we're all flawed, and that while I learned lots of great things from my parents, I also got some really limiting beliefs from both of them as well. And so I've been able to identify the source of some of those, but I didn't ever think on a bigger picture perspective either. I tended to just think, oh, well, this is just the way it is, right?
Right.
So one of my questions there, though, reminds me of, I shouldn't pick on my wife, but she doesn't listen to these very often. I'm joking. But in terms of where we get our sources, so my real question is how can we be more open to different perspectives? Because I think, I think that's a threat to many of us. In other words, if I'm left-leaning, so my wife every night watches the same political shows, and I can assure you she never watches the other political shows.
Right.
And, so how do we become more open to different perspectives?
I think, part of it is just being aware that the perspectives we're getting aren't necessarily as broad as we anticipate, or as objective as we think they might be. And the more that we're sort of aware that a lot of the people we're talking to are going to be very similar to ourselves, and that's wonderful. It makes it easy to communicate with people who share your own experiences and have your background and can understand you, and so there's a lot of ease of communication that we have. But part of what we need to do then is actually just simply expose ourselves. So, for instance, now, especially as a scientist, I started using a lot of social media I wouldn't have used otherwise, and look around a lot more for different news sources, and try and figure out where's all the news coming from, what was the original source. I'm checking different sites and trying to see what are they trying to sell, how are they selling it, what kind of appeal are they looking for. And you realize that they all have sort of tried to figure out certain audiences and sort of cater to certain audiences, and realize that part of what happens on a day-to-day basis is people are trying to figure out what we want, and then trying to feed us that, and to push back and say, if you really want to be informed and to make good decisions, you want some diversity in the information you're getting, and that takes effort.
I want you to talk about diversity of network in terms of, again, I have to focus on this to some degree, how people can, I suppose, be more successful professionally, because that's probably the main reason people are listening to my podcast. And you've talked about we need to have a broader network of more diverse people. My concern about that is that people's first thought is, well, I want them all to be in the right economic group so that they are people that can open doors for me professionally, even though I could, they might see the value on one level, but they're thinking, well, my time is limited. It's got to be, it's got to help me, expand professionally. Is there an example you can give to demonstrate how that's helped somebody, or that you researched for your book?
Yeah, I think one aspect. So one thing you're sort of pointing at is that our opportunities, especially when you come to employment, are really closely tied to our acquaintances. And most jobs, one thing that's really striking in terms of the numbers, when you look at job availability, 50 to 70% of jobs are somehow found through referrals, right? So if I don't know somebody at a company, it's really difficult to get my foot in the door, and it's hard to get my application looked at and so forth. And there's actually important studies by Mark Granovetter, was a sociologist who sort of first pointed this out, and he talked about the strength of weak ties. And a weak tie means, there's some people who I'm interacting with all the time, and these are really close friends, and then there's other people who are either past acquaintances that I've kind of lost touch with, or I talk to occasionally, or people that I met once, or so forth. Mm-hmm. There's thousands of people like that, and they turn out to be really important sources of information. So his dissertation and then some of his follow-up research pointed out that these individuals actually account for a lot of the job referrals. Right, so it's not your best friend that necessarily gets the foot in the door, but it might be somebody you knew from high school and haven't seen in years, and you just happen to be talking to and saying, oh, I'm actually looking for work, and they say, oh, I happen to know somebody, and I'll put you in touch, and somehow that it's really important to have somebody to put you in touch. Without that, it's really difficult, and so the networks matter in ways that we don't anticipate in terms of, even casual acquaintances can be very important.
So you're saying you never know what might come from who you know. Correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, and
exactly.
It isn't necessarily your closest friends. And it's so funny you bring this topic up because earlier today I was talking to someone who runs a region of, one of the world's largest financial service companies. So when he runs a region in the US, and his complaint was why so many of his recruiters were not leveraging their network at all, even though ironically they're in a people business. In other words, right. Without stating the obvious to you or to everyone else, these are people that they built their business off good relationships. They didn't build it off cold calling. And now they are stuck in going to Monster and other online recruiting sources, and it's driving him nuts. So, he was asking me about doing some kind of session on that. Now, I don't need to go into more detail on that piece. But the question I have for you is, why is it though that even people that are in a people-oriented vocation are more comfortable using cold sources than they would leveraging like the strength of weak ties the way you were just talking about?
Yeah. Part of it is that I guess there's always a reticence to sort of use up your own capital, or put people in touch with each other. You're kind of worried maybe they won't get along, or maybe it'll come back to me, and somebody will be angry at me for referring them, or so there's always some danger that things don't work out, and I think part of that fear is what makes referrals valuable, right? Because if a company is using its own employees to get new referrals, they realize that their employees have something at stake, and this is somebody they're going to have to live with, and they're going to have to have in their own business and so forth. And so there's something at stake, and it could be that if you're just trying to hire somebody to find workers for you, that they don't necessarily have enough skin in the game, or enough at stake to really want to use their own social capital to do that.
That's interesting. So that sounds like a lack of confidence, or fear of looking badly. That, gosh, if I hire you to work on my team and it doesn't, or you struggle, that's going to reflect badly on me, or it's easier to bring in some complete stranger that I sourced cold, because then if it doesn't work out, and which unfortunately often in sales it doesn't.
Exactly, yeah.
That's very interesting. So that really is the piece that needs to be addressed then, really, is what am I really afraid of, and what can I do to shore up the training that I'm providing, or I would also argue to believe more in the work I do, to have more conviction behind it, so I feel like I am bringing someone in for all the right reasons. And of course I can't control everything about whether they succeed or fail, but
right, yeah. And the more that your recruiters are part of the team, then the more that they are interested in really feeling that that they're helping build this, and that they have the incentives then to go and say, look, who are the best people I can find for this, not just who can I find to fill this position and get a commission, but who's really out there that would fit perfectly for this and really make this a better place.
So if you could almost, forgive me for this tacky question, almost like list out the benefits here of this meeting people that you wouldn't otherwise meet. In other words, I've started to compile a list, and some of it is unfortunately in my own head. You've talked about the value of weak ties, that you just never know who you might run it, who you might meet that could someday you be helpful for them, and vice versa. Clearly you'll become, there's a chance to become more creative because you're probably going to be exposed to some new and arguably, maybe better ideas. Talk about some of the other benefits to this, because it is a kind of a fundamental piece to your thesis, I think, right?
Yes, yeah. Part of it is just that the kinds of the way that networks constrain both opportunities and information means that when you're really separated and you're in your own group, you're really just looking at things that can be very redundant, and somehow you've got to be reaching out to make those connections, whether it's referrals or information or other kinds of flows. And one other thing I think that people don't realize is there's a lot of social inequality, and what I mean by that is there's a rich get richer kind of effect. The more customers you have, the easier it is to get new customers. You can actually meet people through your customers, and the more business acquaintances you have, the more business people you can meet, and the more friends you have, the more friends you can make, and all of these things snowball. And what tends to happen is, people who become more central actually then even become more central as a result of that, because they're easier to find, they're easier to meet, and so you get these kind of feedback effects. And so there's a value just in having connections, not only for the direct impact that they give you, but all the indirect and the potential growth that comes from that. So, once you've met one person in a group, it becomes easier to meet others, and then you can actually become integrated into that community.
Sorry for interrupting. How do you become thoughtful about that in terms of time use? And the reason I bring that up is because I have spent, I feel like, too much time building a network in some ways, although it's ironic I say that now, because now it's really benefiting me with finding people to interview for the podcast. But there have been other times with my business where it felt like, and I know this from many other people too, you could spend all day meeting nice people, but it, in terms of like determining ultimately who's going to be valuable. I feel like the world is full of mostly nice people. It's just that clearly there's a time limit on how much time we can spend with them, because we all have responsibilities for other things. So can you talk about strategy, or being strategic or thoughtful about how you build that network?
Yeah, I always think of it as it's not so much, you don't want to be too Machiavellian about it and be cultivating friendships just greedily for the kinds of things that they might eventually yield for you. I think what's more important is just being aware of the fact that that everybody brings something to you, and the more aware you are of what's going on, the more the better time manager you can be in terms of probably spending more time with people you wouldn't have necessarily done, and less time in the sort of comfort zone of hanging out just with people that you hang out with all the time. And it's just a little tilt more than a sort of full calculation. But you're right, we all have limited time, so we can't spend time trying to do everything and interact with everybody and so forth. So it's sort of a fine line, but I think we tend to tilt too much in one direction, and it's just sort of pushing a little bit and more towards the outside would be helpful.
Yeah, a different topic that I wanted to raise for sure when I talked to you today was this notion of the key people that you spend the most time with. Because when I interview people for this podcast that have done extremely well in certain areas, almost without exception, they talk about how they built a different core of close people in their network. In other words, they changed who they surrounded themselves with. And I know that, again, it sort of ties in very much to your book. But I guess maybe my question is well, is that what you found? And more specifically, again, what specific types of things can people do to elevate their network?
Yeah, it's a little tricky. A lot of it's serendipitous in terms of sometimes the things happen that you didn't expect, and the people that open doors for you and help you along your way are unexpected individuals that in hindsight, had connections to things that were very important for you. But it's not easy to see that necessarily before the fact. But I think part of it is just appreciating people for all the things that they have, and the more that we can connect with people and be somewhat empathetic and helpful. A lot of what goes on in our networks is somewhat through reciprocation, right? None of us like to have friends who are very needy and never give. Mm-hmm. They're always asking you for favors and never have anything to offer. So part of it is just connecting yourself in ways where you can offer things to other people, and you can be helpful and build relationships that can be bilateral and mutually helpful.
I'm assuming you're familiar with Adam Grant's work in his book on give and take, correct?
Yeah.
So for those of you listening, again, if you're not familiar with Adam Grant, so he's a Wharton professor who, I think it was 6 years ago, wrote a book called Give and Take, and his research found that it was the givers in networks of all kinds, definitely not just business, but all kinds, that got themselves furthest ahead. So you just, because you just mentioned reciprocity.
Yes, yeah.
He called those people matchers. Said most of us are matchers. He said, but the people that do the best are the ones that are just happy to give and genuinely like helping people within reason. Like they don't do it all day, every day, because then you go out of business. Did that kind of overlap at all with some of your own work or findings?
Yeah, actually, I've done some research on understanding how informal networks work in terms of people getting help from their friends, and so we've done studies on actually in areas where people rely, sort of poor villages in India, for instance, where people rely on their friends for help, for money, and even just medical help and other kinds of things. And one thing you see there is that one real key to helping a relationship along is having friends in common, right? And so if you and I are trying to establish a relationship, and we want to help each other out, or maybe one of us asks another one to do something, if we have a friend in common, we have a much higher chance of succeeding than if we don't have a friend in common. And part of that is that third person is sort of a witness to this relationship, and if we behave badly, that reflects poorly to that friend, and that sort of spreads then through the network. And the more that we have people that are common friends, the more reinforced our relationship becomes, and the more important how we behave internally becomes. And I think a lot of what we do, we're always conscious of the fact that reflects on our reputation and sort of how we're viewed by a community. And the more embedded these relationships are in groups of people, the stronger those can be. And sort of that give and take that you're mentioning is, once it's embedded in a social context, it can become much more powerful.
Again, I want to come back to doing the uncomfortable things, because in my life experience, it seems like people are more open to doing uncomfortable things when they're in pain, when they've hit sort of a low point, or they're really frustrated. And again, I'm sure there's people listening to it that are in that situation because they want more out of life. How do you how do you help people be more open to change? Because it seems to me, and I just want to add to this. I mean, I feel like, again, so correct me if this is mistaken, but I've heard this so many times, and I assume it's true, but maybe it isn't, that, as human beings, we're mostly creatures of habit and we resist change. However, everybody also likes to do some new things sometimes. It just seems like we're more open to doing new things, i.e. more uncomfortable things, when we hit a low point, or we hit a birthday ending in a zero, or we've gone through a divorce, or something's sort of painful and significant, or we've lost one of our parents. We're more open to change.
Right.
But the thesis of your book, I mean, in a way, it's almost, in a way, we're not doing your book credit because it's got a macro picture about the potential turmoil that could be down the road with unskilled people losing jobs to technology, and that could create even, you didn't go as far as civil war or riots or whatever, but I mean, those types of concerns. But from an individual standpoint, how do you get through to people more to be open to trying uncomfortable things.
Yeah, no, I think, part of it's just the consciousness. I think, part of it is we just don't realize how set in our ways we are, and we realize that we're creatures of routine, and that we have jobs, and that or tasks. Maybe we're students or whatever we're doing. That we do it, and we tend to go through the same steps, and it's very difficult to break out of those things. And as you're pointing, there can be disruptive points in our life that force us out of that. But the key thing is trying to just be aware that we're in those ruts before. We don't need something catastrophic to happen to shake us out of that, but instead to say, look, you can do this, before you need to, before you're forced to, and enrich your life in ways that you wouldn't have done before that happens. And I think it's just sort of an awareness, and also, we don't realize how insular our networks are, and how. Once you see the pictures and you realize how segmented the networks are, and how pocketed and cliquish they are, and people talking to the same people that are just like them, and then you realize that it's sort of more an extent. We all realize we're embedded in networks, and most of the time we're talking to people similar to ourselves, but we don't really realize how overwhelmingly segregated the world is in terms of those networks.
What are you working on to get more word out about this on a bigger scale to the communities that are very socially immobile? Well, it sounds like all communities are, but that need it the most because they're the most disadvantaged.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, I think. So, for instance, right now, one thing I'm writing is a piece that sort of is trying to explain, what kinds of policies can governments take to try and overcome this and help people. And so, for instance, as you're saying, there's pockets. So inequality, there's various aspects of it. So partly it's growing, and there's people who are disadvantaged. But the interesting thing about it is that it's systematic in terms of who's disadvantaged. So there's a lot of immobility too, and if a person's in a certain community and has low-income parents and so forth, they're much more likely to be low-income themselves, and so part of it is not just addressing the inequality. I sort of think of it as the following: when we start talking about things like universal basic income, different medical care, these kinds of things, those address symptoms of inequality. But they're not addressing the basic social structure that's really behind it. And so it is important to address the symptoms, but we have to take a much deeper dive into it to really affect the basic social structure that cause the inequality and trap people. If they don't have friends that are employed, they don't have opportunities to get employment. If they're in a school where nobody studies and nobody goes to college, it's very difficult for them to ever think about studying and going to college. Those things are much more basic and pervasive, and taxes aren't going to undo that. You need more fundamental policies that help people reach out beyond their existing networks.
Yeah, and I want to bring this up, and forgive me, I don't know how this is going to sound, but I'll tell it as a story for listeners. But the thing that blew me away, that one of the things that started me on this road that I'm on now professionally, was about a year ago. I was on my LinkedIn, and I got a couple thousand people that I'm connected with, and I've coached a lot of them, or certainly, I've probably coached a lot of them over the last 17 years. And what blew me away was how the vast majority, probably at least 80% of them, were pretty much in the same place professionally as they were when I'd known them 3 years ago, 7 years ago, 11 years ago. They were still like, they'd hired me because they wanted to move up from associate vice president or whatever, a certain level of partner in a firm up the food chain. And it boggled my mind how few had done so. I was gutted. I think it's one reason I'm having these interviews is part of me feels like I failed them, even though I know I can't do the press-ups, the push-ups for them. But the reason I'm bringing it up now is because you talk about it on certainly for lower economic classes, where certainly the consequences are far more severe than having a reasonably comfortable job at a bank or as a financial advisor, whatever it might be. I totally acknowledge that. I'm not trying to be insensitive, because it's more the principle of it. But the principle to me seems to be, it's kind of what you said in the book, as well. But it was the same for the middle class people as well, really. And I interviewed someone not too long ago that used a statistic. I assume it's accurate-ish, but he basically said that most people earn, within 20% of what their parents earned. And because I'm fascinated in talking to the people that have gone through that. And I'd still like to think it applies to all of your work, regardless of economic class, because it's the principles that count. But what do you see in the people that, I guess, that do surpass those things? Because it sounds like it's the same thing. And if the middle class people are basically networking with similar middle class people with similar middle class connections, they're going to end up getting similar opportunities, and therefore they don't raise their game. So is it fair to say it applies at all levels except at the very top, where you've got, I loved your story about the Medicis and how they rose to power. Where they're central people, they've got tons of influence. Is that about right?
Yes, I mean, I think it's very much right in the sense that, you're surrounded by a set of people, and those people determine your opportunities and your basic information, and especially growing up in life, they make a big difference in terms of how you perceive the world and what you perceive as what you aspire to and so forth. And it's very difficult to reach out beyond that. And it sort of has effects on both ends, in the sense that, there's really talented and productive people who never get opportunities. And then there's other people who get opportunities that really shouldn't have had them, and, are sort of overplaced. And it's because they knew all the right people and got there, so we all know, both kinds of situations. And it's not easy as an individual to overcome these, very strong social forces. Right. And I think that's part of the reason that you've probably had, some of the difficulties you're mentioning in sort of elevating people dramatically is not easy, because they're still entrenched in this, a certain set, and it's not easy to get those opportunities and to distinguish oneself. And, again, reaching out and broadening your network is probably the easiest way to try and make a difference, but that's not even easy. The other people on the other side are always wary of strangers who are coming in from the outside, and it's not easy to make those inroads.
Yeah, you've got a lot of work. I mean, you've got a tough task, because it's interesting, and I will bring this up, and I thank you in a way for not bringing it up, because I went through part of your book thinking I could skip understanding the word homophily. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
And then I realized, okay, I cannot read this book without understanding this word, but it's so central to your book, I think it's fair to say. For those listening, homophily meaning the tendency to interact with people similar to yourself. So basically, birds of a feather. So we spend time with people much like ourselves, and certainly, Matt has talked about that already in many different ways, but just how central that is to our behavior. But what I didn't fully understand, and you've explained this already, but I just want to repeat it or emphasize it, is that it doesn't just impact who we know and even therefore opportunities. It also impacts, and as we've discussed, but it doesn't, I want this to sink in more, it also impacts what we believe, because we're impacted by the environment that we grow up in, and we assume everybody gets the same access to the same information. Not true. But it also impacts our behaviors and what we do, because presumably based on, can you explain that? So how come it impacts our behaviors? We're human beings. Why should it make any difference?
Yeah, we're humans, from a very early age, imitate others, and it's especially true. We see it strongly in teens and children, that they look for cues as to how to behave by what's going on around them. And parents have a big impact on that, but also it's amazingly powerful. Especially you have a couple kids and you start looking at how they pay attention to each other. The younger ones are just wandering around looking for the older ones for cues as how to behave, and I think that's just natural, and it means that if we're in a group that's very insulated from another group, and for instance, in our research, when we look across these high schools and see the divides internally based on on ethnicity and gender and age, they really are split into groups, and those groups can be completely insulated from each other, and that's fairly dramatic, and means that people within the same close proximity can have completely different norms and cultures, and and we usually act like the people around us. We like to conform. I mean, basically, that's a strong instinct in humans, and it's difficult to overcome.
And how do we overcome that? Is it,
well,
does it keep coming back to the same thing, just being more open, being aware of how we're limiting ourselves one way or the other, whether it's opportunities, beliefs, or behaviors, but then also, I've lost my train of thought there for a second, but then...
I mean, how do we overcome this? It's not easy. And in some sense, reaching out is one thing, but often people who go across those divides are seen as traitors too, right? So suddenly, if you start acting differently, like in my profession, if I start taking different techniques and trying to publish things that look very different from normal research in economics, it's not easy to get it published, and it's not easy to get people to accept it and read it, and so whatever you're doing, the more you reach out and the more you start looking like somebody else, the less you're accepted by your own group, and so there's a sort of danger that you put yourself out there and and then you're sort of in no man's land, right? You're not one of either group, and so connectors can be really incredibly creative, but they can also be viewed as outsiders. So it's tough. There's no easy answer on that one.
Yeah. And forgive me if this doesn't totally connect to what you just said, but it's something I wrote down about 2 minutes ago or 3 minutes ago, and it was always been a sore point for me, or a challenge for me, or a hot topic for me in terms of, I'm trying to think of how it connected to what we were talking about. Oh, right, humans imitating others. So
right.
Again, I have to use the sales scenario, but it could apply in any field, I suppose, is sort of mimicking best practices of the top people.
Right.
And it's more around it's all about the limitations to that I'm interested in the sense that in theory, for example, in financial services, people bring in their top person and say, be like him, be like her, do what that person does. And it would almost never work. And I always assumed it's because people in the audience sort of found excuses or reasons to say, well, I couldn't do that, or I don't have that personality, or whatever it might be, even though this person had a recipe. So so I struggle with how this all fits into sort of elevating what you want to do. Well, actually, and coming up with creative new pieces. This is where I'm going. So actually, you might have to humor me on this one and talk a bit further, because again, I've been turned away on occasion from certain industry events because I'm not an insider. They're like, well, we only want someone that's done this. That we want people that only know our industry, even though, as you spoke to, usually the best ideas come from outside. I'm not saying that means me, but just the principle of it. So you've got this insular attitude that seems to have some success, but then you're saying that to be, if you really want to be the best, you've got to be open to something from a different world. Is that how
right.
How consistently accurate is that advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky and it's contextual. So there's no, I think, there's a bunch of studies that look at creativity and combinations of skills and how well people succeed. And for instance, there have been stuff on scientific articles and which ones have the breakthroughs, and do they involve teams of people from different subdisciplines and so forth. And generally, you find that there is some key, and it's sort of a fine line in the sense that you can't have wildly different ideas and try and combine them. Often things are sort of incremental, right? So you combine something that you know well with something that fits into it, and you can understand how it fits, and then you make an improvement, and those improvements come not necessarily from completely dramatically different ideas being combined, but ones that sort of fit together, but you wouldn't have seen unless you'd sort of reached out. And so I think that thinking incrementally, but looking for big increments, but those big increments tend to come when you're exposed to new ideas, not just tweaking and making slight improvements on what's existing.
Do you ever get together with small groups, sort of like a mastermind? Because one of the things I'm thinking of right now is the story about Henry Ford and God, was it Edison, Thomas Edison, and how, I don't know if they were actual neighbors in Michigan, but they kind of put together a mastermind group, and it was the elevation of their ideas when they all got together. And I believe Andrew Carnegie was in a similar type of, Napoleon Hill wrote about it in his Think and Grow Rich book. But I was just curious if you leveraged that or had that experience, again, to get ever better ideas, whereas you say there's a foundation of commonality, but then better stuff comes from it. Do you have experience with that?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Actually, I can give you a fabulous example. So there's an organization in Canada, which is called CFAR, which is the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And they have an amazing template, and I've been lucky enough to be part of it for about a decade now. And what they do is they pick a topic. So one of the topics I'm in is sort of understanding how countries get better, institutions and organizations and growth. So what makes for good countries and good practices internationally in terms of institutions. So they pick a topic like that, and then around it they build a core of researchers. But they try and make sure that the researchers are connected to the topic, but coming from different areas. Mm-hmm. So for instance, in ours we've got economists, political scientists, anthropologists, and we all come at things from a slightly different angle, but the synergies are quite amazing. Mm-hmm. And so, you sort of cultivate this, and then we meet 3 times a year and spend 3 intensive days at each of those time periods just exchanging, ideas and work. It's a small enough group so that we can really interact intensely, but the most rewarding research experiences I've had are sort of through that organization and through these meetings, and they're really incredibly mind-opening, and there's just enough diversity to make sure that we're all, getting new feedback and interest, but enough similarity in the way that we approach problems that we can talk to each other. And that combination is really powerful.
Just curious, how many people are in the group?
So it's roughly a core of about 20 to 25 people. So it's a fairly big group. Yeah. And basically we take turns in sort of presenting our ideas and our research, and then we'll spend maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours talking about a given person's research, and then we have a lot of free time where we talk, but in coffee breaks and lunches and dinners, and a lot of collaborative research has come out of that project, and I think it's really changed my thinking dramatically. Mm-hmm. But having that kind of opportunity where you put together groups of people that come at things from slightly different angles but can still talk to each other, that's sort of like the sweet spot of really creative thinking.
It's funny, I'm actually thinking of working on that. Well, I am working on that, something like that myself, so it's great to hear about the format that you use. I'm jumping back to a slightly different topic, but yes and no, in terms of what also occurred to me again, the people who, in terms of meeting new people, it seems like when we're feeling most stuck in life is the time when we're least likely to want to get out there and talk to anybody, let alone new people, and yet it sounds like that's what we most need to do. Any advice for people that are being a bit too introverted at the moment?
Oh, I mean, so one thing that I can tell you something about how people do this normally, which is sort of interesting. I was involved in a study with a couple of social psychologists from Stanford, Jamil Zaki and Sylvia Borelli, and the study actually looked at who people turn to in times of trouble, when you have sort of a problem and you need somebody you trust and so forth, compared to who you just sort of hang out with. So we were actually looking at undergraduate students and their social networks. Mm-hmm. And what we found, we looked at the personality profiles of these individuals, and what we found was that the people that were really central in the network when you had problems and you had you needed some advice or you needed some help, those were very empathetic people. They were really high in empathy.
I'm sorry, who were the most empathic?
Those were the people. So imagine that I have some traumatic event, I fail an exam, or I lose my job or something. Who do I turn to talk to? Mm-hmm. And you look among the people. If you ask who do I name is the person I would turn to, that person tends to score high in empathy.
Okay.
So those individuals are empathetic, pretty high on the empathy scale. Whereas if you ask, okay, I just got some great news. Who do I share it with? Who do I go and hang out with and have a beer with after, to celebrate or something? Those people are not high on the empathy scale. Those are just more central, social people. And they're less likely to sort of ask me, oh, Matt, how do you feel about this? And, where are you going? Or to give me advice on what to do next. They're just going to go out and, have a good time. And so there's different people we turn to in different situations, and what their personalities are can make a big difference in sort of, what we get and whether we really get good advice and they're listening carefully to us and helping us out.
So you're saying it's sort of helpful then just to be more aware of who we turn to in different scenarios, and we almost are you saying that the people who aren't very empathic are the ones we should go to when we're stuck, because at least it will get us out meeting new people, or we do one thing at a time?
Oh no, I mean I think actually it's partly if you really want help and advice, those empathetic people can do it, and the question is, I think when you're turning to different people, being more aware of what that person's like and what are they able to give you the kind of advice that you need and the help you need. Are they going to really listen to you and think carefully about what you're saying, or do they understand you well? So those are people that you can really rely on, deep friends and people who really care for you and can help you out. And in times where you need real advice, those can be amazing people to reach out to, but they can be very different from the person that you would want to reach out to get a connection for a job or to get information.
One of the things you mentioned is, in you concluding the book, is you say we need to get better at filtering information, and I assume that's tying into sort of how we've accumulated the things that we choose, our beliefs. Do you have any sort of specific kind of practical tips on that? And a part of me is thinking along the lines of, many of us spend too much time on social media, and it sucks up a bunch of time. It's not productive. We just get that sort of quick shot of whatever it is.
Right.
Something.
Yeah, some sort of endorphin. Yeah.
Thank you. But what can people do to better filter information so that they can tune into things that can help them grow?
I think one thing is being aware of the fact that a lot of social media, in particular, in the way that we're fed news and the way that we navigate through that system, is one that's designed to find out what we like and then to feed us what we like. And those algorithms can be very reinforcing. And so algorithmically, over time, if you're clicking on certain stories from certain news services or certain kinds of things, it'll tend, we've all seen this, where, suddenly we get ads that look like what we just bought, but that's going on all the time. And the more we're aware of that, the more we realize that can be suffocating, in the sense that eventually that means that we're getting fed the same stuff over and over and over. Yep. And so, deliberately, if we're clicking on things that are a little further out and maybe don't look quite as interesting, but are a little off topic, that can help diversify, sort of realizing that we're inside an algorithm, and then try and manipulate that algorithm and try and push it in ways that are going to feed you new things rather than just feed you the same stuff over and over.
Yeah, so on some level, some of the things that you most recommend require us to get off autopilot and to be more conscious and deliberate about how we spend our time, and I suppose then hopefully also the actions we take, and then also that's good, that in turn will expose us to bigger and better opportunities, or certainly different ones, and give us different and more creative ideas, which hopefully has a sort of domino effect even within our network of meeting people we wouldn't otherwise meet. And I can testify that to myself just in the last 6 months, mostly with the podcast interviewing. I mean, people I've contacted or talked to that I would never otherwise have met, probably as long in my entire life I would never otherwise have met. And then last year I did it was a favor for a friend really, but in a completely different industry. And as a result, I started, trying to reach out to contacts. And again, that too had me meet people that I would never otherwise have met. Yeah. But we really have to somehow find a way to do it, presumably in a manageable way where it's not overwhelming time-wise, but where we can see some benefit and as you said, have realistic expectations. In the word, sometimes nothing positive will come of it. Or say, well, that was kind of a waste of time, but not to give up. Right?
Yeah.
That's perhaps the bigger message: is don't give up, because I'm assuming, maybe incorrectly, but I'm guessing you've been to conferences that maybe were a bit ho-hum, but then you've been to others where you're like, oh my gosh, I never imagined I'd meet this person or learn some of these things. It completely shifts how I was looking at this topic. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Right. You have these eye-opening experiences, and exactly. So I think one thing is just being aware. And the more aware we are of how constraining our usual interactions are is one thing. And then the second is, putting ourselves in those uncomfortable situations, going out and reaching out a bit more, and then realizing that those have feedback effects, right? That as you was pointing out, you meet new people, and then that opens a whole set of contacts and an area of information and so forth that you never had before. And that combination of just being aware of it and then going out a bit more and realizing that those feedback effects can be quite powerful all together, that already can be life-changing.
And do you think that, and so I'm in wrapping things up now with couple final quick questions, if people are stuck or they're hesitating to take a bigger leap in their life, do you think those are the two key points to just start to become more aware of what's working and what's not, but also to start being okay with some uncomfortable situations to expand their network? Is there one more other key piece to that or nuance to that would help people take a bigger leap?
Yeah, I mean, I think those two are, and realizing that these effects are, they're somewhat random. They're not. It's not a sure thing. You will get, as you're pointing out, good and bad outcomes, and to keep trying a bit and not give up. So it's not drastic where you want to completely change your life and everything, right. But it's sort of the more aware we are on the margin, and the more that we can be pushing against all these forces that are closing in our worlds, I think the better off we'll be. And so I think it's sort of just more a slow, constant, marginal battle than one where we need to take drastic steps and big changes. It's more just everyday little things that we can do to improve our lives.
I love that line, push against the forces that are closing in on our world. That's pretty powerful. So thank you so much, Matt. This has been really fascinating and useful in many levels, and I think this is one I need to listen to again to kind of, because I probably had some my own confirmation bias coming in, and I want to make sure I listen to the bits where I was focused on my question. But then in wrapping up, how can people I guess get your book and learn more about you and the work you're doing?
Yeah, so actually Google's a pretty powerful search engine these days. So you just type in Matthew O. Jackson, and you can find me easily. And then there's links to the book and other things about what I do and how I view the world. So,
well, thank you so much. I mean, I know it's funny because you only got to allude to some of the really big stuff you're doing with government policy and things, which I mean I'd love to ask about, but in fairness, doesn't directly relate to my topic. But good luck with all those bigger things, and hopefully we'll come back with some stories about how this is helping people on smaller levels, which is, I suppose, one person at a time, which is where it all starts. But anyway, but thanks again. I really appreciate it, and I'll let you know as we develop. And then, sorry, for listeners, then again, please put into action some of the things. What my favorite idea related, I have to say, around the mastermind group of leveraging other people's ideas to kind of increase the perceptions of what's possible and what's going on. But then the whole piece about, I would just make it micro in terms of at least once a month put something in your calendar or diary that's where you'd say, this is not something I would typically go to, but I can see that it's going to push me on a different road, and it may not work this time, or it may not be of amazing value, but it's definitely healthy, and ultimately good things are going to, and different things will come from it. I think that's a beautiful suggestion, given how how this tendency to interact with people just like us ultimately isn't in anyone's best interests all the time. Otherwise, my show notes will be on the website, matt-anderson.com. Otherwise, I'll finish with my favorite question, which is, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? I'm Matt Anderson, and this was The Road Not Taken.